Good morning, Floridians, and welcome back to your Teaching American History project. Our seminar this morning is Key Allied Decisions in World War II, and as always, is brought to you by the Florida Virtual Schools and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. Some of you know me, others. Let me introduce myself. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this morning's session. I want to remind you that when the session is over, you can go to the Key Allied Decisions website and find the PowerPoint and the readings. You will also find there the evaluation. As always, please fill that out and send it back to us. They're very important to us, and they're important to your Teaching American History project as well. Again, you will receive documentation of participation after the seminar so that you can, once we receive your evaluations, so that you can present that to your local certifying authority and get whatever credit your participation in the seminar warrants. We've got a lot of material to cover this morning, so let's plunge right ahead. We had some really interesting questions on the forum, and one of the things that the forum impressed me with was that the extent to which World War II is still very much a presence in our lives. We had two participants, one whose father whose father landed at Normandy and fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and another participant whose grandfather landed at Normandy and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And a number of you said that you wished you'd spoken to your father and your grandfather about their experiences in World War II. So this war is still very much with us in memories. And you had some really good questions in the forum. How prepared was the Roosevelt administration to shift from progressive domestic reforms to fighting a world war? Did FDR have prior knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack? Regarding World War II, contemporary students seem to know only the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bombs. How can we broaden their understanding of the conflict? How large a role did the Soviet Union play in the defeat of Nazi Germany? How much cooperation was there between the Soviet Union and the other allies? What role did U.S. industrial capacity play in winning the war? How did nations like Germany and Japan respond to our efforts to change their societies? And finally, how are the key decisions of World War II still felt today? To help us address those questions, we're very pleased to have with us this morning James Sparrow, Associate Professor of U.S. History at the University of Chicago. Jim's field of research include modern United States political and social history, war and society, social science and the state, technology, history, and the new media. He is the author of Warfare State, World War II, Americans, and the Age of Big Government. So let me turn the program over to Jim right now to help us understand key Allied decisions in World War II. Jim, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Richard. And let me just say it's a real pleasure to be here and to get your questions. I'm looking forward to the discussion with all of you in the seminar, and I'm very pleased by how effectively the NHC has set up this seminar. I want to mention that you'll hear some banging in the background. That's the very old heating system here at the University of Chicago, and I apologize for any disruption it might cause, but this is a building built in 1929, right before the crash.
The crash, I take it, of the stock market, not the building, right?
Right, of the stock market.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Jim. We'd have all thought that you had a little pile driver in your office or something like that.
Yes. So before we get moving here, I want to lay out a backdrop for the documents that we'll be discussing. The most important thing to take away from this seminar, I think, is that the United States entered the war in a very particular way after much of the early decisive fighting had already been accomplished by the Axis aggressors. The United States entered the war largely unprepared to fight in December of 1941, despite some defense preparations that were industrial in nature. In a military sense, it was not really prepared for the battle in December of 41. And that was mostly for political reasons having to do with the debate over intervention in the 1930s. And so it would need at least a year to mobilize fully. Consequently, the key issues the United States faced in intervening in the war were to determine the timing and location of its entry into two different theaters, the Pacific versus the European theater, and how to make the most of its biggest contribution to the global effort, which was its industrial production. The United States became the arsenal of democracy during the war. By 1943, it was producing 5 times as much industrial output as Japan and twice as much industrial output as Germany. And this really was the central contribution the Americans were able to make to the victory. The British and especially the Soviets were doing most of the fighting prior to that point and throughout the rest of the war, and their casualties reflected this. The Soviets in particular lost massive numbers of people, 10 million soldiers, between 10 and 20 million civilians. It was what the historian Timothy Snyder has called the Bloodlands. So the Americans were contributing in an industrial way, but they were, of course, also doing very important fighting in the Pacific, and eventually they would play a strategic role in their interventions in first in North Africa and Italy, and then crucially with D-Day and the invasion of the continent across the Channel between Britain and France. The British wanted to delay a cross-channel invasion at all costs to avoid a repeat of World War I. The Soviets wanted a cross-channel invasion as quickly as possible. So the two big powers allied with the United States were at odds with each other over their goals in planning strategy. If that alliance did not form successfully, if those differences broke the alliance apart, then the war itself threatened to break into 3 or 4 regional wars in which the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese and the Italian fascists could continue to pursue their successful strategy of dividing and conquering their enemies. So the preeminent task for Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was the key member of the key political leader of the alliance, his task was to keep the alliance together, to avoid being divided and having the Soviets and probably the British conquered, and maybe the United States if it was eventually encircled by fascist enemies.
Jim, Jim, if I could interrupt for a second, it might be useful to go to our slide in which we've enumerated these things, the next slide there, to help people follow along. There we go. Good, thank you.
Yes. So we see the Battle of the Atlantic is the submarine warfare the Germans directed against the Americans even before December of '41, but with increasing ferocity throughout the war in an effort to break up Lend-Lease. This is to prevent the shipment of war material over to the British and the Soviets. You see how far the Nazis expanded throughout. They basically held the better part of the European continent. Came within miles of Moscow by '42, and then their allies, even Spain, which was neutral, was really effectively functioning as an ally, held the rest of the continent. And Japan also quickly took control of almost the entire Pacific and the better part of East Asia, all the way over to Burma, hedging in on India. So, Americans tend to think of the beginning of the war as starting with Pearl Harbor. That initiated American entry. Of course, this was just one part of a much larger, massive assault. The British suffered an even more devastating defeat in Singapore. So these advances by the Axis were shattering and threatened to drive apart this fragile alliance as well. So the first documents that we'll be looking at will try to consider what often doesn't appear in scholarly treatment of grand strategy, and that is the soft aspects of power, the ideological task of making the case or charting the grounds on which the alliance could be formed. What principles could all three allies agree on in order to orchestrate their military and diplomatic objectives in an effective way to counteract the Axis? So the other thing I just want to mention before we move on to these early slides is these slide 11 gives you the basic economic facts supporting the discussion I just provided of the sort of economic balance of power that the United States really tipped the balance toward the Allies. And I wanted to also mention that if it wasn't possible to produce economically as the Americans did in their splendid isolation in the Western Hemisphere, then it was possible to destroy productive capacity. And this is what the Soviets did with their scorched earth policy as they retreated during the German invasion in Operation Barbarossa between 1941 and the end of 1942. So as the Soviets retreated, they destroyed all of the industrial capacity. We see economic generation here in slide 12 is just at a fraction of what it had been prior to the German invasion. And this table, which you can expand on your computers, shows that the production of coal, of iron ore, and other essentials also went down to a mere fraction, 7%, 2% of what had been the case. So the Soviets destroyed productive capacity so the Germans couldn't seize it, while the Americans expanded their economic production. So here we go to the sort of the soft constraints. And we start with the Atlantic Charter. This was a key statement of shared allied principles. And what I'm going to do with these slides is I'm going to try to condense them down. I'm not going to read everything. The language that's highlighted in red represents passages that you might want to bring to the attention of your students. That can reward close reading or careful reflection on the implications of decisions made in that. The strategic documents are more about decisions, but this document, the Atlantic Charter, is more about language. A couple of things to point out here. This is before Pearl Harbor. This is August of 1941. Well after the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, when it's clear to Roosevelt and his administration that the U.S. is probably going to end up in this war one way or another, and that it will need to rely on allies, and Britain is the most obvious ally. But before it was possible politically to really fully acknowledge that, Roosevelt was skirting the line of legality here by not quite announcing an alliance, but announcing principles. So it's significant that this, in fact, was not, it looks like a constitutional document, the language says that it's signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, but in fact it was a press release that was sent by telegram. And that was because of the difficulties of maneuvering into a relationship with the British without actually forming an official alliance. And in fact, the British and the Americans had been planning their joint strategy since the spring of 1941 in the ABC conferences that get mentioned in later documents. So in slide 16 here, we see, first of all, that a determination to learn the lessons of the League of Nations and its failures and larger political failures of the interwar period. So no territorial aggrandizement, the right to self-determination is reaffirmed. And then tacked on there is an insistence on free trade, that these are goals that will help preserve a peace after the war, and that the failure to attain these goals was the cause of the war in the first place, at least in the eyes of the British and the Americans. Then we turn to the next slide, which gives you the rest of it, and you see here that the groundwork for a lasting peace should be couched in, or should be understood as a matter of freedom from fear and want. Now that's a reference to the four freedoms, the principles that Roosevelt had enunciated in building his case for the Lend-Lease program of aid to first Britain and then eventually the Soviets to fight off the Nazi aggression. But this is an injection of a kind of New Deal language, a social democratic language, that there are social and economic foundations of peace, not only military, political foundations of peace. If you're interested in this larger point, you might want to read Ruth Borgward's book, A New Deal for the World, which has a nice meditation on the Atlantic Charter and what went into it and what its implications were for the UN and for the post-war world. The other point made in this slide, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, and I'll go ahead and make the other point, and then I'll come in.
The other point was to emphasize disarmament and collective security. This is laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the United Nations. The Americans, I want to point out here, the Americans, especially Roosevelt, continually injected planning for a post-war collective security organization because they believed that this was a way to reorganize world politics away from the great power basis that the imperial powers, Britain and France and the European colonial powers, had used to organize the world and had failed to avoid peace as a consequence.
Okay.
Richard, you had a question?
Yes, first, A New Deal for the World. Who's the author of that again, please?
This is Liz Borgwardt, and I'm happy to send an email that will mention.
Okay. Well, you just give me the spelling of her last name. I can put it right here on the chat.
Yeah, Borgwardt.
Okay.
The world.
Okay, there it is, folks. And then we have an interesting comment here. The punishment of Germany in World War I seems to have led the Allies to this announcement to ensure that that wouldn't happen again. To what extent is the Atlantic Charter informed by the lessons of World War I?
That's a great question, and very perceptive, and it's absolutely correct that it is directly informed. In fact, much of the Second World War, when you look at the decision makers, you see constant references to the mistakes made in the First World War. And those mistakes have to do with the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, to which the commenter is referring, which imposed really just devastating reparations payments on Germany, which Germany couldn't repay. And then the United States, because it couldn't repay those to France and Britain ended up being unable to repay their debt obligations to the United States. The United States throughout the 1920s refused to cancel those debts, insisted on repayment. So it created a cycle of, and then at the same time, American stockholders bought German municipal bonds. So they ended up financing a debt-based Weimar Republic that became increasingly unstable, producing a massive spiral of inflation, which made it even more impossible for the Germans to pay off their debt, and even more impossible for the French and the British to meet their obligations. Eventually, that economic collapse, which was linked to the stock market crash in 1929, that destabilized German society and laid the groundwork for the Nazi seizure of power. And this was quite apparent at that moment. And this is an attempt to create an ideological response to that failure that doesn't openly blame, say, the British, who are a key ally, but does acknowledge that some new basis is going to be found for peace. And for the Americans, that's the United Nations. I mean, we often, when we read the history of World War II, and people like Borgwardt, we see an emphasis on the United Nations as a search for a solution to the failures of Versailles. And then when we read the history from, say, 1946 to 1950, it's all about the Cold War, and the UN becomes a sort of a fig leaf of power. What I want to emphasize here, and I think is useful to emphasize in teaching, is that for someone like Roosevelt, who was a key architect both of the United Nations and or at least the thinking behind the United Nations, and of the realpolitik. Remember the idea of 4 policemen who would rule the world after the war was Roosevelt's, one of his favorite metaphors. He pursued both strategies because he thought that the American interest was to avoid reverting to a greater British Commonwealth or an organization of European powers, which the League had devolved into. But he also didn't want to revert to anarchy. He felt that it was necessary to take the wartime alliances as being built and transform it into a post-war political organization. Are there other questions on that line, Richard? Should I
no, why don't we move ahead right now?
Okay. So so now what we see is that we have this language which is very important because it uses a kind of Anglo-American constitutional language as well as inflected with the sort of New Deal social democratic language. Now we see how it might look to other people who have to be kept in this coalition in the future. In this case, it's the Polish government in exile, the London Poles, trying to maintain Polish sovereignty after the fact of first Soviet invasion and then Nazi invasion during Barbarossa. And we can see that there are these consequences for both the fact of the American and British alliance that the Atlantic Charter announced, and also for the language used. The concern here for the Poles is, as you see on slide 18, that the abstract character of the language might be inadequate or even dangerous. And we'll see when we talk about the occupation of Eastern Europe by the Soviets that this was in fact the case, particularly for the Poles. On the 19th slide, you see that the immediate danger is that the Germans are using the Atlantic Charter for propaganda, to divide and conquer the peoples of Eastern Europe and to dishearten the Poles, suggesting that the Americans and the British we're just going to extend the British Empire and colonize the rest of the world if they had their way. That they weren't concerned with small nations like Poland. And here at the end, and on the 20th slide, you see this endorsement, this call that the Soviets should endorse the Atlantic Charter is really very desperate. They're very fearful of what the Soviets will do if they are able to prevail against the Nazis, and rightfully so. So they're hoping to hold the Soviets to the language of the Atlantic Charter. And here again, we see how language has consequences. And the Atlantic Charter is a reference point throughout the war. All right, now I want to move on to the Arcadia Conference. This is the conference held immediately after Pearl Harbor. The British, including Churchill, came to Washington and stayed into January, and in the process helped not just forge a grand strategy for the early part of the war, including laying the groundwork for the invasion of French North Africa, but critically also assembled the principles and the list of nations that would be part of the United Nations before it was a world government, when it was simply an alliance. And here in the 20th slide, we have Harry Hopkins writing to Roosevelt, alerting him to the need to be very careful about the use of language in the declaration that would eventually be issued in January. And so you see the insistence on keeping the language of freedom, justice, and security for all the people in the world. And that it's not enough to simply reaffirm the Atlantic Charter, but it has to be worked into this document on which the alliance will be built. This next slide, 21, you see that the Soviets insist on the use of the term Hitlerism. Compare this to the references to fascism in the Atlantic Charter and in other documents prior to this period. And you see the Soviets have a very particular need. They are fighting what is now a nationalistic war against the Nazis rather than, say, pursuing international revolution on behalf of the proletariat. And Hitlerism has made it very personal. And the Soviets need to use this language in order to use this kind of document for their own peoples. Fascism, Nazism, Japanism, these are not as resonant. So that language is in there, but we also see this language in the preamble in their own lands as well as in other lands. Now this restricts it instead of everywhere. In other words, the freedoms that these freedoms first enunciated in the Atlantic Charter, now reiterated here, will apply to peoples in their own lands as well as in other lands, but not necessarily everywhere. This covers Soviet concerns about securing a perimeter of friendly, so-called friendly states to their west, and it covers British concerns that they might be giving up their empire in the process of forging this alliance. Okay. So
we have Jim, we have a question here. Why did the U.S. not want to include the Free French in the country list?
I think that's a great question. It's a matter of trying to decide what inclusion in the United Nations means. The Free French were mostly a defeated people at this point, and the fall of France had indicated a degree of collaboration with the Nazis that was troubling. it was deemed more appropriate to recognize those who were fighting and who were continuing to fight, and also to exclude those who seemed maybe not to have organized the resistance appropriately. Now, subsequently, the Free French would become lionized, and I don't want to overemphasize this. This exclusion of the Free French is a quiet one. But it is telling because you look at eventually we get to the Declaration, and you see the nations here that are mentioned. You've got Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic. So there's a sort of signaling here going on that some small nations should be included. The avoidance of mention of the Free French reflects the sense that those who are fighting and contributing to the victory are going to be in one way or another. And the small countries, of course, are not fighting, but the Americans are concerned to secure their flank in Latin America, to secure the Western Hemisphere. So they want to bring in any allies they can in the Western Hemisphere to at least get them on paper to be on board with the Allies. All right. So now I'm going to return to the Declaration that eventually produced here.
Okay, if we have one other question, Jim. Let me just see if we can clarify why the Soviets wanted to use the word Hitlerism as opposed to Nazism or fascism. They wanted to personify the enemy. They wanted to make it a really kind of personal fight. So that word was used to inspire their people. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and the other thing I would mention is Nazism sounds like an ideology that, at least to American ears, would sound like totalitarianism. And in the late 30s and early 40s, this term was used to conflate fascism with communism.
Nazism was. That term was used to conflate fascism and communism?
Totalitarianism.
Oh, I'm sorry, totalitarianism. Okay.
Nazism with Soviet-style communism.
Okay.
And the Soviets, at this, in an earlier phase, would talk about, imperialists, meaning imperialist capitalists, and would conflate Nazism with capitalism. Once you get to the point where the Soviets have to ally themselves with the British and the Americans, the preeminent capitalist powers in the world, of course, they can no longer emphasize the ideological inframing of what Nazism represents to them, nor do they want to affirm, an ideological inframing that would make the communist system look in any way like the Nazis. So, hence the emphasis on personalizing and nationalizing the enemy.
We have another question here, similar vein. Was Hitler the focal enemy of the Russians? Did they find Japan and the other Axis nations nominal enemies?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, there was very little attention to Japan. This was more of an elite concern that the Russians, that what had been lost in the Sino-Russian War in 1905 could be regained and expand the Soviet Empire. But the Russian people were focused exclusively on what was, frankly, a death struggle with the Nazis.
Okay, we've got about an hour to go.
Okay. All right, so on to the Declaration. We've just discussed the Declaration. Let's move to the Chiefs of Staff sort of wrap up post-Arcadia of what the implications were of the alliance that had just been formed. And we see in this slide that they're reaffirming a strategy that had actually been developed in early February of 1941, that Germany was the predominant member of the Axis power, that Germany had to come first, that it was the most dangerous enemy, and that if it could be stopped and defeated, that it would be not so difficult to then mop up the Italians and the Japanese. So this has very large implications. That you have this early on. This is being issued in the dark days of early 1942, when the Japanese swept across the Pacific. This is when American forces were being pushed back and decimated. Eventually, in places like Corregidor, you have at Bataan, you have death marches. the Americans are not yet able to turn the tide. It's not until the summer of 42, Midway, which is the first real turning point, and when the Americans begin very early to reverse the momentum. This document is before that, and even here you see an emphasis on a grand strategy that puts Germany first. It doesn't just put Germany first; it insists that anything that doesn't contribute to the defeat of Germany should be minimized. So the American people think they're fighting a war against Japan, and there's a large portion of the populace, very well organized politically by Pacific First advocates in the press, people like Luce. They think that the United States should be focusing exclusively on the Pacific. In fact, the Navy is pushing hard to make the war primarily about the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur, not known for his tendency to agree with the Navy, also thinks the Pacific should be first. Of course, this makes sense given his experience his beleaguered experience in the Philippines. He eventually has to retreat to Australia to try to retake the Philippines. The Joint Chiefs become so disheartened by the British desire to avoid a cross-channel invasion that they begin to toy with the idea of turning to the Pacific. But in fact, Germany never ceases being the central strategic goal that Roosevelt pursues. And Roosevelt, during the war, centered control in his hands. He marginalized the State Department. He met separately with the Joint Chiefs. So strategic decisions were really Roosevelt's decisions, and he never abandoned the Germany first strategy. But what he did do, he liked to say he would never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing. What he did do was he continued to maintain priority for the Pacific. So up until about 43, he devoted roughly half of American resources to the Pacific, much more than was called for in this memorandum or had been agreed upon in Arcadia. And he did continue to try to provide any sort of advantage in the Pacific that was possible without crippling the effort in Europe. So,
Jim, we have some questions here about this decision to place Germany first. How did the American public feel about this decision? I mean, after all, it was Japan who attacked Pearl Harbor. So how did they feel about this decision to place Germany at the center of the war effort?
Well, there was no official. Well, let's just say there was no official emphasis on this decision. It was downplayed. It became apparent over time, but most of the publicity and most coming out of the OWI, out of the Treasury, emphasized the war in the Pacific at this point. So as Roosevelt was known to do, he was very deft at concealing his plans, what he was trying to accomplish. The Pacific First lobby was so powerful, he would have suffered crippling political defeats that would have limited his discretion if he had really, truly emphasized the degree to which the United States was emphasizing Germany.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question here about the press. You said FDR was pretty adept at hiding his strategy. Did the press was the press aware of this? Did they play a role in helping him conceal his strategy?
Yeah, I mean, no. The press was able to suss out what was going on, but it's a matter of official recognition versus versus press speculation. The other thing was that the United States government had a security of information policy that really discouraged discussion of strategy and tactics and even the reporting of losses. In fact, there was early speculation about the losses at Pearl Harbor, and those had to do with the administration being very quiet about precisely how much of the Navy in Pearl Harbor had been lost. And the reason for this was a quite sensible one, which is you don't want to let your enemy know how badly you've been damaged. You've been almost treasonous to let the Japanese know how much damage they had done at Pearl Harbor. But at the time, it made the press very suspicious. And throughout the war, Roosevelt did not have the best of relationships with the press. So far from cooperating, I think they were constantly trying to pry information out of the
Okay.
situation.
And did FDR's strategy of dividing resources have a significant impact in either theater?
Yes. I think it was precisely because Roosevelt used his discretion that the United States was able to successfully pursue a two-theater war. This is really an unprecedented accomplishment. When you think about it, these were two major wars. The United States was victorious in both theaters. If the Navy had had its way, there's a very good chance, and not just the Navy, but the people pressing for a Pacific First strategy, there's a very good chance that the Nazis would have prevailed. It's not clear, but especially if Lend-Lease had been restricted, if the Battle of the Atlantic had gone in the favor of the Germans, there's a very good chance that the entire European continent could have gone to the Nazis. If the British had prevailed, there's a very good chance that the United States would have had a very difficult time in the Pacific. I'm not certain there was ever a chance that they would have lost, but the United States, the American people might have lost heart for a protracted and a bloody race war in the Pacific if there weren't sufficient resources. So I would actually say it was precisely this allocation of roughly equal resources when in fact grand strategy was calling for an almost exclusive focus on Germany that allowed the United States to pursue this two-front war. That and of course the extraordinary industrial might of the United States.
Okay, well shall we move ahead then?
Yes. This next slide shows the strategy known as tightening the ring. And the idea was to attack peripheral areas like North Africa that could be more easily taken, and then gradually suffocate Germany, somewhat in the manner that Britain had used the blockade of Germany in World War I to suffocate the Wilhelmine government. So, of course, the problem with this strategy from the Soviet point of view is it delays in cross-channel invasion. And then finally, you see here a little indication of what is ultimately a British interest in the Balkans, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So we'll move on right now. Right, so now we turn to the Allied invasion of French North Africa in the fall of 1942. This decision was a difficult one because the Soviets, this may have permanently alienated Stalin and led to the Cold War. It pushed back the cross-channel invasion until 1944 because after taking North Africa in the fall of 42, then it took 1943 for the Allies to make their way up the Italian peninsula. And so it wasn't until the spring of 44 that Britain and the United States could cross the channel and invade. And that was determined by this strategic decision of encirclement by way of the Mediterranean. On the other hand, it accomplished some important things. First of all, the British were not willing to conduct a cross-channel invasion. They would not do it, and the Americans couldn't do it without them at that point. They could try, but it would probably be disastrous. Both the combined might of the British and the Americans was necessary. So, given that, Roosevelt was determined to accomplish some kind of victory. An early victory was necessary because of the ongoing defeats in the Pacific in early 42 and the terrible state of affairs on the continent. Africa was the only feasible place to do that. There were only a few German divisions there. And the Germans looked like they were about to enact a pincers movement going from East Asia and the Balkans southeast and going from Africa due east, that they could meet in the Middle East and then gain control of the strategic oil reserves there. So it was valuable to preempt that pincers movement on the Middle East. And so ultimately, this made a lot of sense in a political way, but it came at the cost of alienating Stalin. So this brings us now to the the Casablanca communique. So Stalin, Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Churchill, and de Gaulle met after the successful conclusion of Operation Torch, which was the invasion of French North Africa. They met in Casablanca, and then we come to this communique. And this is when a first decisive decision is made after the invasion. And that decision is to pursue a policy of unconditional surrender. Now, the language in the slide refers, again, in a kind of defensive way to how the Nazis were able to use this initiative for propaganda and claim that the British and the Americans were abandoning their allies, the Soviets, and then pursuing imperialistic adventures in the Mediterranean in Africa. Now, this embrace of unconditional surrender was a sop to Stalin. It was an attempt to show resolve to Stalin that the British and the Americans committed themselves to not terminating, not signing any separate peace agreements until the Nazis had been completely obliterated. This commitment would have very long-term consequences. Some analysts argue that it spurred the Germans to fight to the death, to fight longer than they might have if they didn't know that Nazism was going to be completely extirpated. Likewise, it's been argued that it pushed the Japanese to fight longer than they might have. That the kamikaze fighters and the desperate last battles of 1944, 1945 might have been avoided, or at the very least, perhaps the end game of the war in the Pacific and the dropping of the atomic bomb might not have been necessary if some softer language about surrender, particularly revolving around the emperor, could have been embraced. And as we know, the emperor eventually was not pushed from his position. So then why emphasize unconditional surrender? Well, because it was a core political strategy to keep the Soviets in. The other thing I'd point out about this slide is just the reference to the barbaric leaders of the Axis powers versus their people. The constant effort in Anglo-American propaganda to make a distinction between the Nazis and the German people, between the imperial Japanese and the Japanese people, although to a much lesser extent because the war in the Pacific was heavily racialized. And for the Italians, it was very strong, this desire to make a distinction between the fascists and the Italian people. The Soviets didn't share this distinction. Really the war on the Eastern Front was a genocidal war on both sides. Okay. Now,
Jim, we have a question. We have a question
yeah.
here. Why did Stalin decline to attend the Casablanca conference?
Well, I think two reasons. The first is he was busy, right? I mean, this was right in the decisive moment when the Soviets are pushing back the Nazis. The Battle of Stalingrad in January of 43. Eventually, they prevail at the Kursk salient in the summer of 43. So this is the tipping point. And at that tipping point, it becomes clear that the Soviets may be able to prevail against the Nazis alone, or at least that they're doing all of the fighting. And that gives them a major advantage. So Stalin wanted to wait until he had a much greater negotiating position, which he did eventually at Tehran toward the end of the year. The other thing was, I think there was real anger at the commitment to Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa.
Okay, and we have another question here. The language of this document seems much less formal than the previous one, even the Atlantic Charter. Is there any particular reason for this? Well, this is a communique, so it's a different genre.
But I do think you see a kind of a concern with language that's strategic here, but the what you see is kind of the inside thinking behind the formal announcements that get made. Now that I just brought up, is there another question, Richard?
No, we can move ahead.
Yeah, I just brought up this slide of the Italian campaign. You see, I don't know if you can see, it's a bit contracted here, but it takes a while for the Allied forces to make it up Italy. And Stalin was an incredibly canny judge of military logistics. He knew exactly what was entailed. The Allies made very quick work of invading Sicily and going up through the southern half of the Italian peninsula. They got to Rome, and the Germans had taken over, and the fighting from there northward was really quite bitter and costly. So there was this sort of false optimism prompted by the early part of Operation Husky, the invasion of the Italian peninsula.
Let me ask this, Jim. If the Allies had decided to bypass Italy and just gone on to invade Western Europe,
Yeah.
would that have had much impact on the war? I mean, how important, how strategic was Italy to the American victory over Germany?
That's a great question, and a very important question. It was a diversion, but it was an important diversion, and as I've suggested, it was important for psychological and political reasons for the British and the Americans to do something. And the British were not prepared to cross the channel. The Americans really, even by late '43, still weren't ready to cross the channel because the United States was so far behind in its mobilization. And so it was necessary to do something. This was what could be done. And it did eventually position troops to invade southern France. And so Stalin eventually seizes on this as something to do with those troops. And as we'll see, Churchill has other plans because the British are trying to bide their time. You know, ideally, if they could avoid invading at all and wait for the Germans and the Soviets to wear each other down, that might be a perfect outcome in the eyes of Churchill and the men at Whitehall. But of course, that wasn't possible, so it was a matter of delay. Churchill also was hoping, as we'll see in later slides, to maybe invade the Balkans and cut the Soviets off, because he could see that the Soviets might sweep through all of Eastern Europe and the Balkans and then hold that territory.
So all these calculations were done with an eye toward what Europe was going to be like after the war.
Yes, and the other thing is, remember that the British had held the Mediterranean and then had lost it, and then were in the process of regaining it. Italy allowed a resumption of control over the shipping lanes in the Mediterranean, and an anchor there on the Eastern Mediterranean is Rhodes and Greece, and so the British are thinking of their interest there. The Americans don't have interest there; they want to maintain shipping lines, but there was quite, intense debate over the strategic value of taking Italy. And Roosevelt ultimately decided it was crucial to sustain the alliance, if there was going to be any successful invasion of France, it couldn't happen without the British. And the British had maneuvered into this position. But now was the time to decide what to do about those troops.
Okay, we've got about 45 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So then the British and the Americans convene in Washington, and you see these two quotes. The top one is from Roosevelt, arguing that every resource of men and munitions should be used against the enemy. This is a kind of coded language reminding Churchill that the Soviets are not happy with the delay, right? That all resources should be used against the enemy where it's needed. The quote at the bottom is from Churchill. And he's encouraging the Americans to step back and take a bigger picture of what's possible at this moment. We have the authority and the prestige of victory. It was our duty to redouble our efforts and grasp the fruits of our success. So you see a shift in language here that reveals Churchill thinking, what could we do in the Mediterranean? Let's suspend our discussion about crossing the Channel, which is a daunting prospect and off in the distance. What could we accomplish here while we're beginning to take control of the Mediterranean? So then, and you see a more explicit consideration of the Balkans here. I don't want to go into all the language, but if you read this section closely, you see that Churchill is thinking in a very clear way about what the Soviet advances might mean. Well, then in August, we move on to the conference in Quebec. also between the Americans and the British. And on this slide, we see that these are notes from the combined chiefs of staff. So the British and the Americans were so close that they had a combined chiefs of staff that then worked with the Joint Chiefs and the British brass in order to coordinate military activity. So these are this is a memoranda from the combined chiefs, and you see they're concerned about German strength in Normandy on this slide. And then on the next slide, they're concerned that Operation Overlord, which is the code name for the invasion of Normandy during D-Day, is going to be nothing like Operation Husky. Only superficially could one make a comparison. Now, if you go back to the previous document from the Washington Conference, where Churchill is trying to persuade Roosevelt of the value of the Italian campaign, which wasn't done at that point, he was making an argument also that this was a kind of preparation, that this would get the troops battle ready and tested. Chiefs are saying, no, these are totally different. And implicitly, they're suggesting, look, the heavier lifting is Overlord, and let's not get distracted. Now, I have some slides in here following this. The first one shows the air war, and the next two are on the actual Allied advances on the ground. The reason I have the air war up here is to remind you as you're teaching this that although the Brits and the Americans were focused on the Mediterranean up until the middle of 1944, they were carrying out a massive campaign of bombardment of key German cities. Now, this was initially a retaliation for the German bombardment of London in the Battle of Britain. But over time, it was really pursued because it was a way to act against the Nazis without invading. And for internal reasons, the advocates of air power within the British and the American command were making a case that air power should be the central consideration in modern warfare. By the end of the war, with Curtis LeMay's bombardment of Japan, this argument would prevail, and in the late 40s and early 50s, it become central to American grand strategy. But at this point, the claim was that it would demoralize the German and the Japanese people, and here that the firebombing of places like Dresden eventually would convince the Germans that American and British superiority was so massive that they should give up. Turns out that the post-war surveys, the post-war strategic bombing surveys done for Germany and Japan showed the opposite, that it actually spurred both the German people and the Japanese people to fight harder. However, it is also true that this bombardment did disrupt German supplies of fuel, which was critical in decreasing their industrial capacity. So the Americans, the British referred to this as softening up the Germans for the invasion, weakening them so that the invasion would be more successful. The Soviets saw this as more dallying, sort of a self-indulgent dallying that left them to bleed to death along with the Nazis on the Eastern Front. When the British and the Americans finally did invade at D-Day, they had to make a landing within a very narrow strip of beach in Normandy. You see the cutout here demonstrates how geographically constrained that was, and then to go through that bottleneck to then sweep to the east to make the march on Berlin. Now, I just want to point out here, this is June 5th, 1944. The United States entered the war on December 7th, 1941. That's a very, very long time for the Soviets to wait. And so we see this next map makes clear how the Soviets might have viewed this. Just the sense of proportion the Soviets would bring to the respective contributions of the British and the Americans versus the Soviets.
Okay. Jim, I think you've just answered one of our forum questions. How large a role did the Soviet Union play in the defeat of the Nazis? This chart, this map, I think, answers that question. It was decisive, right?
Oh, absolutely. Now, of course, in a conflagration as large as this, it would be impossible to say that any one factor won the war. So it's not, it's certainly not true that the Soviets won it on their own. They needed Lend-Lease, but they did fight it on their own on the Eastern Front, and the vast majority of German and Allied deaths took place on the Eastern Front. Likewise, it would not make sense to claim that D-Day won the war. It was decisive because it took pressure off of the Eastern Front, and it allowed for a pincers movement on Berlin, and so for various reasons, it was very important, but it certainly wasn't the thing that won the war. Nor was American industrial production the only factor. It was absolutely critical. Without it, neither the Soviets nor the British could have survived. But it was the Soviets who really, for the most part, did the dying, and they needed that equipment in order to successfully push back the Nazis.
Was Stalin the most advanced leader as far as being a strategist is concerned? And another simple yet perplexing question, the Allied bombing. I mean, that was expensive, and it did, as you said, disrupt their fuel and probably their industrial production. So, two questions then. Was Stalin the most advanced leader, and why were the Germans able to hold out so long?
I'm going to answer them in the reverse order. If you go back and look at the table for the GDP of the different powers, take a close look at Germany's GDP and look in particular at their per capita GDP, and also look at the Axis GDP. The Allies included many colonial nations that were highly impoverished by design in some ways. The Axis actually concentrated their territories within fairly concentrated industrial power. The Germans had the most concentrated industrial power outside of the United States. And they had been militarized since the Nazi seizure of power, right? That had been their design all along. Plus, the German government had been organized on a quasi-military model, or at least had been heavily influenced by Prussian militarism for a very long period of time. You could say even maybe going back to German unification. So it's not just a matter of sheer industrial might, it's also organization. The Nazi government was organized from top to bottom around war and a war of conquest. They were a deadly enemy. I think Roosevelt was right to believe that he needed the Soviets, that he couldn't just leave the Soviets to fight against the Nazis, as some isolationists wanted him to do, and let them bleed themselves to death. Because the Nazis would almost definitely have prevailed if the United States did not join in the effort. Now, the other question, was Stalin unusually gifted, or was he, I forget the exact language, but he did have an extraordinary acuity when it came to matters of military strategy and a sort of Machiavellian grasp of how political power worked. I don't know that he was any more brilliant than Roosevelt or Churchill. I mean, these really were three of the most accomplished political leaders of the 20th century. Accomplished, I use that, in quotes, because Stalin used his accomplishments to pursue genocide and political repression for millions of people. So, I mean, I'm not equating them, but I would say that they were each other's peers in their insights into how strategy worked and how politics worked. The difference is the Americans, the British, and the Soviets had very different geostrategic positions. Soviets held the Eastern European heartland. The Americans were an ocean away. The British were about to collapse. Their entire empire was about to fall apart because they had been exhausted. So they were in very different bargaining positions and had to take up very different strategies. Roosevelt was, after the war, was accused of having betrayed American interests and betrayed the interests of small nations like Poland or of weak allies like China. But in fact, the cards that Roosevelt held were very limited because of what the Soviets had already accomplished before the Americans landed a foot in Normandy.
Okay, we have a question here. Laura Wakefield writes, but I thought Stalin's bloodletting of his top military is one of the main reasons Russia suffered so many defeats at the hands of the Nazis. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not saying that he made decisions that we would make. I'm saying that he understood political survival and military strategy. Now, that decision to purge the top brass was very costly, but it allowed him to consolidate power. And then the defeat of the Nazis was largely a matter of brute force. The Soviets simply had more people and more land, and were able to exhaust the Nazis. And the Nazis were overly ambitious and made some key mistakes. Now, if one's principle is national interest, if the guiding rule behind military strategy and grand strategy is the well-being of the people, then you could say, yes, Stalin made major mistakes. But I'm not sure we should say that that was Stalin's motivation. His motivation was political survival and political control at any cost. And so in a very Machiavellian way, he calculated that he could live without his best generals, and it turns out he was right. He calculated that he could defeat the Nazis, but it would cost millions of lives. But those lives were cheap to him. In fact, they were utterly disposable. So, from an American point of view, that's an absolute failure because we have a sort of democratic value of our people. But from Stalin's point of view, he accomplished almost everything he could have hoped for, given the cards he was dealt. But you have to recognize we're talking about, Stalin was definitely Hitler's equal in the tyranny and the sort of genocidal will to power he was willing to exercise. And in that sense, was completely unlike Churchill or Roosevelt. But as we'll see when we look at Tehran and Yalta, if what we're talking about here is strategy, right? What moves to make next in war? You see that Stalin has a very canny grasp of what's on the table. His sense of what's important to preserve, his values are utterly different, but his understanding of how the logistics work, how the strategy works, is very acute. And that's what I mean when I say that he had a powerful grasp of how power and strategy work.
Okay, well, we've got about 30 minutes, so shall we move ahead?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm going to skip past. Well, all right. So here we are at Tehran. Tehran's important because it's the first meeting of the Big Three, right? It takes place in late 1943. And at that point, the war's outcome was already clear. Stalingrad and Kursk were behind the Soviets. They were pushing well into Eastern Europe. The Americans were also making great headway against Japan by late 43. It was apparent that the Axis was going to lose. It was a matter of at what cost of time and human life. The Declaration of the Three Powers captures the sense of what was possible for the alliance at that moment. And I don't have time to go into it because we only have half an hour left, but I think these discussion questions are useful for opening up discussion with students, in particular noticing the strategies adopted by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Roosevelt begins by talking about the Pacific Theater, which is his explanation for why the Americans have taken so long to get involved in Europe. Churchill starts talking in a very sort of high language about, Roosevelt talks about a family. Churchill's really talking about God and about civilization. Stalin has no patience for Churchill and cuts right to the point, which is what are the facts on the ground and how should we act. So as always, not very interested in anything but the disposition of power. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff military conclusions are really interesting because they give you a sense of what was going on behind the scenes. And here, I'll just quickly summarize that that Churchill was still emphasizing at this late date the possibility of going from the Italian peninsula into the Balkans And of course, Stalin is not interested in that because he realizes he'll be able to take all of Eastern Europe if he's not interfered with. Okay, I just want to move along quickly here and get to the post-war scenario here. So the meeting in Yalta in February of '45 really was a meeting about the post-war world. So the big three reconvened and sought to hammer out what would be the big commitments. And Roosevelt was able to walk away from Yalta with a commitment to the UN, which would then meet later in that spring in San Francisco, the former charter, and also some sort of ground rules for the reconstruction of Europe. Stalin was able to walk away with an agreement that it would not be interfered with in Eastern Europe as it took back Eastern Europe. This would cost Roosevelt dearly in the press, and then in the post-war periods, Democrats would take a beating for what was considered to be a betrayal of Poland and of China at Yalta. So we have here reference to the Atlantic Charter. And the reason I want to point this out is that when you all go back to your syllabi and try to figure out how to bring some life into these considerations of high policy and grand strategy, you see that again and again at these moments when big decisions are being made, there's a return to this charter. And if the charter was just a piece of parchment, if it was just a bunch of flowery language, that would be unnecessary. So why is there a return here to the language of the charter? Well, in part because it has the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. And self-determination, so echoes of the League of Nations here. It's a way to try to hold the Soviets to the substance of the alliance, of their agreement in the alliance, that they would have to allow for elections. And so we see here also the terms of liberation. These conditions are supposed to keep the Soviets honest as well as the Americans, and to reaffirm the principles on which the alliance had been founded so that it would continue into the post-war period. For those of you who teach the United Nations, you'll see similar language informing the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this effort to find an ideological common ground continues. But if you know anything about the history of Eastern Europe after 1944, 1945, you'll know that the Soviets violated A, B, C, and D everywhere. They fomented civil war where they had to, if they couldn't seize power outright. They expropriated material even from the victims of Nazi aggression and carried physical plant, factories and equipment back to the Soviet Union instead of carrying out relief. They did form interim governments, but only those that were puppet governments. And then and they were supposed to hold elections, but wherever possible, they rigged them or undermined them. So you have language here that's intended by Roosevelt and to some extent Churchill to hold the Soviets' feet to the fire. But as was apparent even at Yalta, it was very weak tea. And Roosevelt said he did the most he could for the Poles at the time. His view, and the view of the administration more generally, was the fact was the Soviets were already there in Eastern Europe, and there was nothing the Americans could do about it unless they wanted to invade the rest of Germany and keep pushing across the steppes all the way to Moscow. So unless the American people were willing to liberate Poland, this was the best that could be accomplished. And so here we see the limitations of language. But I think it's important to recognize that there's an effort here to try to use language to sort of sustain political calculations the Soviets might have to take into consideration. Okay, so let's see. And we have here language about the Soviet entry into the war in the Pacific theater within 3 months of the defeat of the Nazis. This was important because the Americans weren't sure how much longer the fighting in the Pacific was going to go on. They was concerned that there might be substantial casualties in taking back the whole islands because the Japanese troops had fought so fiercely during the island hopping campaign, pushing them back across the Pacific. So this was considered by Roosevelt and by most within the administration to be a good thing, to get the Soviets to commit to entering the war. After the atomic bomb, the development of the atomic bomb, and after the dramatic progress in '45 across the Pacific, it came to seem less and less of a good thing, especially after Roosevelt's death. But at the time, this was considered a very important accomplishment. Now, here we have the Joint Chief of Staff minutes. And I've reproduced here an exchange between Stalin and Churchill that, you see how Stalin operated, and it's just helpful. You get a feel for the way he worked in closed chambers. He's bringing up the number of divisions that the Russians have used, and getting Churchill to compare those to the American and British divisions. Now, this is not to say the American and British divisions were insubstantial, but it just was a way of reminding them of who held the upper hand in terms of strategic decisions about the fate of post-war Europe, at least in the eastern half. We also see an exchange here between Stalin and the Prime Minister, where the Prime Minister tries to express gratitude. This is Churchill. And Stalin turns it around and makes it clear that essentially the Soviets would have done this anyway, right? Now that they're in possession of Eastern Europe, even gratitude isn't going to get anyone very far. It's a signaling that he recognizes that he doesn't need the Americans or the British for the end game. And so we can see the alliance starting to fray here. All right, now I've included this directive to the Commander-in-Chief of United Forces of Occupation in Germany because I would like you to compare it to the Potsdam document. Potsdam document is the official announcement that this is a meeting in July and August of 1945, where the major powers made an official announcement about the disposition of post-war Europe and Asia. But even before this happened, on the ground in Germany in April, it was necessary to work out some principles of occupation. And I want to highlight here the subtle differences. In some ways, these read as very similar documents. You see the same concerns, even sometimes the same language. But the priorities are very different. So the priority in this document is stated up front. This is like a typical military document, right? They get right to the point. Point A is that the rights, power, and status of the military government in Germany are based upon the unconditional surrender or total defeat of Germany. And then point B is that there is no restriction on the authority, on military authority. They have supreme legislative, executive, and judicial authority. And then we move on here, and you see the objectives are to make the Germans recognize that they are defeated people, and to prevent them from ever becoming an aggressor, so to completely eliminate Nazism. But these are all within pragmatic understandings. And the core of pragmatic understanding is that this military occupation comes first, which means that we feed the occupying forces first before we worry about starvation and relief. Now, and we worry about starvation among Germans and other Europeans to the extent that it endangers the occupying forces. So, of course, the emphasis in, I'll turn back to those later, the emphasis in the Potsdam Conference talks about similar goals, but the priority, of course, is more around liberation of Europe, defeat of fascism, instilling law and order. And so the pragmatic concerns of military government aren't emphasized. Why this matters is that the reconstruction of Germany, and really in many ways of the continent, flowed from the pragmatic requirement of governing Germany after its recent defeat. So you see here a tension between the high idealistic language and the way in which this was carried out. I also just want to point out things that could be discussed in a seminar with students is that to go through the provisions for decentralization, economic decentralization, political decentralization, the elimination of fascism, root and branch, the way reparations would work, the way that refugees should be handled and removal should operate. These are quite intensive interventions in German society. I would say they amount to a kind of social engineering. And they would play a major role in how Germany would reconstruct itself and really become almost a different nation in the post-war period. All right, I just want to go back to these slides because I know we only have 15 minutes left. And of course, welcome anyone who has questions. But here we just have, this is a map of all the cities that were bombed in Japan. Essentially every industrial site in Japan was firebombed by Curtis LeMay's bombers in 43 and 44, starting in May of 43 with the firebombing of Tokyo, which was devastating and actually more damaging than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then continuing with the entire industrial landscape of Japan, and then finally concluding with Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war. The other thing to consider is the steady progress. You see the island hopping and two core thrusts, one in the South Pacific, the other in the Central Pacific, making their way toward Japan. So that brings us to this last memorandum. And it's dated August 6, 1946. So this is the date of Hiroshima. And it's a memorandum from the new Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, James Burns, but he went by Jimmy. Burns had been Roosevelt's main ally in the Senate and also his main opponent whenever Roosevelt crossed his interests, especially having to do with the South. This was in the 30s. Then Roosevelt had made him the main czar in charge of economic mobilization throughout the war. Then finally, when Roosevelt died, Truman took him on as the Secretary of State because Burns had attended Yalta and in fact had famously taken verbatim notes in a special shorthand that only he understood. And so Burns provided those notes to, or a transcription of those notes to Truman, and Truman realized this was the guy who understood the post-war world the best. I'm going to make him my Secretary of State. So this communique is between one of Burns's subordinates who's assigned to handling the Manhattan Project, which is the secret development of the atomic bomb. And he's communicating back to the nuclear scientists that they should not suspend work on the next stage of this research, which was the development of an even more powerful bomb known as the super bomb, later known as the hydrogen bomb, but that they should go forward full steam ahead, and that they shouldn't worry about international agreements. And so this, this I think reveals very clearly that at least Burns and the people in the State Department had a very different view of the post-war world than did the advocates of the United Nations and even other less idealistic members of the Roosevelt and then Truman administration who were pushing for international control of atomic weapons. You see here, Burns has seen Stalin in operation in Yalta and knows what the score is, at least strategically relative to the Soviets, and under no conditions wants to share this kind of information with anyone, much less the Soviets. Now, you'll recall that the Americans had actually developed nuclear power with the British. It was a joint effort, and so they shared this information with the British. And I might add, it was a British scientist, Klaus Fuchs, who eventually gave away the secrets to how to make an atomic bomb, accelerating the Soviet effort so they could detonate their own bomb in 1949, much sooner than anyone within the Manhattan Project thought was possible. But again, this is evidence that the American and the British are so much closer than they are with the Soviets, and that Stalin's suspicions were at least partially well-founded. Roosevelt never mentioned the Manhattan Project to Stalin at any point, kept it in his vest. Truman only mentioned it to him to intimidate him at Potsdam. He he mentioned that in July of '45 that the Americans had just developed an incredibly powerful weapon. Stalin promptly pretended that it was not a very significant consideration, and then moved on to other business because Stalin had an amazing poker face and was able to present a bluff. The point here is that the ground is shifting underneath the feet of major decision makers as they recognize the nature of the alliance that they've been involved with, the nature of what the Soviets are up to. It would still take a number of years before this would harden into what we call the Cold War. But you can see it even here in Burns' instructions. Well, Richard, I think this is the last slide, is it not?
It is indeed, but we have some time yet, and we have some questions from the forum. Let me bring up this one. How did nations like Germany and Japan respond to our efforts to change their societies? How did they respond? In other words, I guess, how did they respond to the Allied occupation?
Yeah. I'm currently working on a book on this, not on the German and Japanese response, but on how it actually changed America, the project of ruling and reconstructing entire societies, West Germany and Japan. In both cases, the United States guided the Germans toward adopting a new constitution that reflected American constitutional values, reconstructed their economies through the Marshall Plan in Europe and through Japanese occupation in Japan. And the interesting thing, I think, the fascinating thing really is how both countries quickly came to embrace a very different set of values. Now, they did set up the point of a gun, so that may not be so remarkable, but if we look at other occupations throughout American history, compare the occupation of Germany and Japan with the occupation of the South in the Civil War, or the occupation of the Philippines immediately after the Declaration of Victory, which led to years of guerrilla warfare. Or we look at contemporary occupation of Iraq. We see that occupation doesn't always go so well. You don't necessarily get cooperation. But in Japan and Germany, what's astonishing is that our bitterest enemies, our mortal foes, ended up working actually quite well with the American occupying forces in a relative sense. Now, here, this is relative to the worst of human nature. Like occupying forces normally do what the Soviets did, which is they just rape and pillage their way through the society and leave it in a burning heap. The American troops weren't always so well behaved either. The newest research on the American occupation suggests that there was more bad behavior than we might like to think, but it was nothing like what the Soviets were engaged in. What's interesting to me is how quickly the German economy returned to the center of the European economy, how quickly West Germany became the centerpiece of European constitutionalism and liberal political values, how quickly Japan recovered and became a real force, a real power within the global economy. By the 1970s, they were rivaling American companies in certain sectors of the global economy, and how committed the Germans became, in particular, to democratic values, especially in Europe, human rights, legal, the rule of law within Germany. The country becomes almost a different country. And Japan, likewise, changed very dramatically. Not quite as dramatically. You still have a very cartelistic arrangement of the economy and a very hierarchical, deferential society. But still, just a complete, a night and day from what had been true under the empire. So I'm frankly astonished. I find it really quite striking, and this is why history is interesting, is that things happen that shouldn't happen, or you wouldn't expect to happen.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here. To what extent did German and Japanese cultural values play a role in the transformation of their society under Allied occupation?
Okay. Well, so first I would point you to some books to read, because it would take a very long time to answer that question. But on Japan, the most important book is John Dower's book, D-O-W-E-R, Embracing Defeat. And in Germany, the literature is more more, it's like has multiple centers of emphasis. But there's an important book on allies. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the title, and I don't want to waste time. But it's on the relationship between the occupying allies, the Germans, and Jews. And I can send this to you later. But that really gives you a sense of how the values of those two societies mesh. My general point I would make is, during the war, there was this claim that the Japanese and the Germans were naturally fascistic. In particular, there's this view that the Germans had a Sonderweg, or a special path toward that was leading them inevitably to fascism. It seems very clear to me that the rapid reconstruction of German and Japanese society, or at least West German and Japanese society, demonstrates that these are not inherently fascistic societies, but rather that fascist political elites had seized power and transformed, but not eternally transformed, the arrangement of power in those societies.
And then another thing, too, we have to remember, while Japan and Germany were devastated, I mean, their economies were shattered, they still had the cultural know-how about how to build and run in major industrial societies. These were big industrial powers before the war. So they still knew that. Even though their plants were gone, they knew how to build them and run them.
They had the education, the social organization,
right,
and the discipline. The other thing, it turns out that bombing did not actually wipe out industrial production as much as had been thought. It was very effective against supplies of oil and fuel, but it was astonishing how easily, even during the war, both Japan and Germany were able to continue industrial production even as they were being, bombed to rubble.
Right. And we have, finally, our last question here. How are key decisions of World War II still felt today? And we earlier had a question about Vietnam. So if you could sort of conflate the two. The question about Vietnam specifically was, why was Vietnam returned to French control after the war?
Okay, I'm gonna flip it quickly,
okay,
because the Vietnam question is rather involved. I would say today's post-war world, we can still see the contours. Look at the debate between Germany and Greece over, Germany had invaded Greece in World War II, and then Greece ended up being very important as a counter, as a site where the Truman Doctrine was articulated as a counterweight to the Soviets and in the communist sphere. While West Germany was central to the American effort against the Soviets. I would say that you still have a kind of geopolitics where Central Europe is the engine of the European economy, and the Germans are absolutely pivotal. The difference is the Germans have woven themselves into a constitutional fabric called the European Union that makes it impossible for them to hive off racial and national boundaries the way the Nazis did. Even if they could, it's just not how German society works anymore. They've really, the elimination of Nazism did become a central part of German national identity after 1945. But so they're just essential, but they're integrated into the economy and the politics of the continent in a very different way. So I think it shows how the difference that history makes, but how these old patterns, these long-term patterns going back to the 19th century, can persist. I would also mention that Britain's relationship to the continent is also very similar. Right now, on to Vietnam. Roosevelt pushed, to the extent that he ever pushed. I mean, he was constantly trying to maintain the alliance, but also push for his objectives. And so he pushed for Indochina, which was a French colony, to be placed under a protectorate that was not in French hands. This infuriated Churchill, who only heard the implications for the British Empire, which Roosevelt was constantly poking holes into. He would bring up the British Empire whenever he could to embarrass Churchill in front of Stalin, and also to put Churchill on notice that the Americans didn't necessarily want to pay for the maintenance of the British Empire. So he brought up the issue of Indochina because it was a way to make an argument for protectorates that would be under, and ultimately they'd be under the authority of the United Nations. And eventually Roosevelt backed down and allowed that the French might be the ones who ruled that protectorate. And then there's a complicated history of the Cold War that explains why eventually the Eisenhower administration picked up the baton from the French when they were defeated at Yom Kippur. But I think what we can see here is that the first openings of a sort of politics of decolonization emerges around places like Indochina. And the reason it happens is because the Japanese defeat all of the great imperial powers, all of the white Western imperial powers who had previously been presumed to be superior racially to the peoples of Asia. That defeat then produces counter-mobilization of national armies in places like Indochina that help push the Japanese out, so they're able to defeat the great power that was able to defeat their former colonial masters. This is an object lesson that sparks a wave of decolonization. And so in this sense, you see a discontinuity between the pre-war and post-war period that is absolute and radical. After this point, the world order centered on colonies and empires is over, and a new world order is appointed.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I tell you, you've complicated my understanding of World War II, and you've left me with, you've given me a lot of information, but left me with a lot of questions as well. And I think you've done that for our participants. We've come to the end, though, so I hope we've addressed all of your questions. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, great, and I want to thank our participants again for their participation in the seminar. Thank you for your questions and comments. We'll be monitoring the forum till January 11th, so if you have questions and comments that you think of after the fact, put them on the forum and we'll pass them on to Jim and get back to you. I want to remind you to submit your evaluations, and I also would like to remind you to check our website, AmericaInClass.org, for our spring seminar schedule. I think you'll find some seminars there that will interest you, in addition to the ones we are doing for the Florida Virtual School Teaching American History project. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a good day, and I hope you all have a fine holiday break. I know that's coming up soon, and when I taught high school, I look forward to that tremendously, and I'm sure you are too. Again, thank you very much, and good day.